Silas Thorne was mending a hole in his boot with a piece of twine that was itself frayed and broken. He sat on the damp, swollen floor of his hovel, a place that was less a home and more a collection of leaks held together by stubborn mold. The air smelled of wet earth and the slow creeping poverty that had seeped into the very timbers of the house. He knew the rules of Blackwood Fen. They were simple, brutal rules for a simple, brutal life. Rule 1. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. Attention was a currency you couldn't afford. Rule 2. Lord Peaton's tithes were not suggestions. The debt was a living thing, an ancient beast that fed on the village, and Peaton was its keeper. Rule 3, the most important of all. The whisperwood was forbidden, and the orcs that sometimes strayed from its depths were monsters. Not misunderstood, not tragic. Monsters, to be feared, to be avoided, to be reported. But then the storm came, a furious clawing thing that tore at his roof and turned the world to a grey blur of water and wind. When it passed, leaving a broken, weeping mourning in its wake, Silas went to check the single snare he kept on the edge of the woods. He was desperate. The larder was not just empty, it was a hollow ache in the pit of his stomach. He prayed for a rabbit, a squirrel, anything. Instead, he found her. An orc, caught in the rusted iron jaws of a bear trap he did not own. She was slumped against the trunk of a great oak, her formidable form made small by pain and exhaustion. Her skin, a deep forest green, was pale and clammy. One of her tusks was chipped, the break a stark white against the darker ivory. She was a warrior. That much was clear from the leather armor and the corded muscle of her arms. But right now, she was just a creature caught and dying. He broke the most important rule of all, and that choice, that single foolish moment of compassion, changed everything. His first instinct was pure, primal fear. It was a cold spike in his gut, a voice screaming at him to turn, to run, to forget what he saw. This was a monster. The stories the village elders told around the winter fires were of orcs sacking farmsteads, of their cruelty, their bloodlust. They were the reason the king's men garrisoned the nearby fort. They were the shadow that gave Lord Peaton another excuse to tax them for protection. To be found near one was a crime. To help one was treason. He took a half-step back, the wet leaves squelching under his worn boot. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. He could just leave, pretend he never saw her, go back to his hovel, to his hunger, to his slow decay. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that would let him live to see another miserable sunrise. But then her eyes opened. Just a slit. They were a startling amber color, like trapped sunlight in the gloom of the woods. And in them, he didn't see monstrous rage. He saw pain. He saw a desperate, ragged exhaustion that he recognized. He'd seen it in the eyes of his comrades in the trenches during the border wars. He'd seen it in the mirror on the worst days, when the hunger was a physical weight, and the dampness of his home felt like it was filling his lungs. It was the look of a being that had fought until it could not fight anymore. She tried to move, a low groan escaping her lips, a sound that was not a threat, but a raw expression of agony. The teeth of the trap ground deeper into the flesh of her thigh. Blood, dark and thick, had soaked the ground around her. She was losing too much. She wouldn't last the day. Silas's fatal strength, the one that had cost him so much in his life, was an iron-willed inability to ignore suffering. He couldn't do it in the war, dragging a wounded enemy soldier to safety and earning a reprimand. He couldn't do it when the miller's boy fell in the river, diving into the icy water without a second thought. And he couldn't do it now. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else rose to meet it. A stubborn, weary kindness that was as much a part of him as his own bones. He cursed under his breath, a soft, bitter sound. "Damn it all," he whispered to the dripping trees. He moved forward, slowly, his hands held up and open to show he was unarmed. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, his voice hoarse. It felt absurd, a scrawny, weak human offering assurances to a creature that could likely snap him in two. The orc watched him, her amber eyes tracking his every move. There was suspicion there, and pain, but she didn't snarl or threaten. She was too weak. She simply watched, her breathing shallow. The trap was a brutal piece of work, old, rusted, but lethally strong. It was not one of his simple rope snares. This was made to maim, to hold something large and powerful. It was a poacher's, or worse, a warlord's. The release mechanism was frozen with rust. He pushed at it, his thin frame straining, but it wouldn't budge. He needed leverage. Stay still, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He scrambled back into the woods, his eyes scanning the forest floor. He found a thick branch, half rotted, and broke it over his knee. It snapped too easily. Useless. He needed iron. His eyes fell on the ruins of an old fence line. Posts long since rotted away, but a few strands of rusted wire and a single iron stake remaining. He worked it free from the soil, his fingers raw and muddy. He returned to her side. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice full of apology. He jammed the iron stake into the hinge of the trap. He put all of his meager weight into it, his muscles screaming in protest. The rust fought him. For a moment, nothing happened. The orc let out a sharp gasp as the pressure shifted, her body tensing. Silas gritted his teeth, his vision swimming. He thought of the debt ledger, of Piton's sneering face, of the gnawing hunger. He poured all of his quiet desperation into that one motion. With a loud groaning crack, the rust gave way. The jaws of the trap sprang open a few inches. It was enough. The orc, with a surge of adrenaline, dragged her leg free. She collapsed fully against the tree, her head lolling back, a sheen of cold sweat on her pale green skin. The wound was horrific. A deep, ragged canyon in her thigh, bleeding freely again. Now came the harder choice. He had freed her. He could leave now. His duty, if it could even be called that, was done. But the woods were cold. She was bleeding, weak, and likely feverish. Other predators, the four-legged or two-legged kind, would find her. Leaving her here was still a death sentence. A slower one, perhaps, but just as certain. He looked down at his own hands, trembling with exertion. He thought of his hovel, leaking, cold, empty. It was barely a shelter for one. Bringing her there was madness. It was inviting the wrath of the village, the ruin of Lord Piton, the end of his own miserable existence. He looked at her face again, at the lines of pain etched around her eyes. He saw another outcast, another broken thing at the mercy of a cruel world. He sighed, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to drain the last of his resistance. "Right," he said to the silent forest. "Let's go." Getting her to his hovel was an ordeal. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled instantly. She was far too heavy for him to carry. "Lean on me," he said. He positioned himself under her shoulder. Her sheer size was intimidating. Her arm, draped over his shoulders, felt as heavy as a log. Her skin was hot to the touch. The fever was setting in. They stumbled through the woods, a bizarre, limping pair. The journey of a few hundred yards took an eternity. Every step was a struggle. He was the crutch for a giant, his own weak frame groaning under the strain. She tried to bear her own weight, her honor warring with her injury, but she was fading. By the time they reached the sagging door of his hovel, she was barely conscious. He half dragged, half lowered her to the floor just inside the door. She slumped against the wall, leaving a smear of mud and blood on the damp wood. The hovel seemed to shrink around her, her presence overwhelming the small space. For a long moment, Silas just stood there, breathing heavily, leaning against the doorframe. The finality of what he had done washed over him. He had brought the monster home. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breathing and the drip, drip, drip of water from the perpetually leaking roof. The sound was a constant reminder of his poverty, a liquid clock ticking away his failures. He looked at her, this creature of nightmare and legend, lying wounded on his floor. Her armor was scuffed and battered. The leather was of a quality he had never seen before, intricately tooled with symbols he didn't recognize. A satchel at her hip was torn open, its contents spilled. A whetstone, a small water skin, and a single, intricately carved wooden bird. Nothing of value, nothing to explain why she was here. He pushed himself away from the wall. First things first, the wound. He stoked the embers in his small hearth, adding a few precious sticks of wood until a small fire crackled to life. He put his only pot, a dented, blackened thing, over the flames with water from his rain barrel. While it heated, he tore a strip from the bottom of his own thin tunic. It was his last piece of relatively clean cloth. He knelt beside her. "I need to clean this," he said softly. She didn't respond. Her eyes closed. He gently, hesitantly, touched the torn leather around the wound. With fumbling fingers, he unbuckled the straps and pushed the armor aside to get a better look. The gash was deep, torn muscle and flesh laid bare. It was a miracle the bone wasn't shattered. Using the hot water and the rag, he began to clean the wound. It was a slow, grim task. He washed away the mud and grime, his touch as gentle as he could manage. She flinched and moaned in her feverish state, but she didn't fight him. As he worked, he saw the scars that crisscrossed her body. Old wounds, a long faded line down her arm, a puckered mark on her shoulder. This was a life of battle, of violence. Yet here she was, helpless, dependent on the kindness of a human she had every reason to see as an enemy. When the wound was as clean as he could get it, he had nothing to bind it with. He looked around his sparse home. His eyes landed on his cot, on the single, threadbare blanket that was his only protection against the biting cold of the nights. Without a second thought, he ripped it into long strips. It was a terrible sacrifice. The nights were cold, and his bones ached with it. But leaving the wound open was not an option. He bound her thigh tightly, the cleanish strips of wool soaking up the fresh blood almost immediately. She was shivering now, the fever taking full hold. He used the last of his firewood to keep the hearth going, feeding it, stick by stick. He managed to get her to drink a little water from his cup, holding her head up. Her lips were dry and cracked. Finally, with the wound tended and the fire giving off a meager warmth, the other reality of their situation returned. Hunger. The gnawing, hollow feeling in his stomach was now a sharp pain. He had gone out for food and returned with another mouth to feed, a mouth that belonged to a being twice his size. The irony was so bitter it almost made him laugh. He looked in his larder. It was a single, bare shelf. There was a small, wrinkled onion, a handful of dried beans, and the heel of a loaf of bread, hard as a rock. It was barely a meal for one. For two, it was a joke. Still, it was all he had. Section. He put the beans and the chopped onion in the pot with more water, setting it to boil. The smell of the thin broth filled the tiny hovel. It was a poor, weak smell, but it was better than the scent of damp and despair. When it was ready, he poured half into his only bowl. He soaked the stale bread in it until it softened. He knelt by the orc again. Kaza, a name he read on a small metal tag on her satchel, a name he decided to use. He nudged her shoulder gently. Kaza, you need to eat. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever, but they focused on him. He held the bowl out. She looked at the meager offering, then at his face. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Confusion, suspicion, maybe even shame. A warrior like her, reduced to being fed soup by a scrawny human. She pushed herself up a little, her powerful arms trembling. She took the bowl from him, her large green-skinned fingers dwarfing the small wooden vessel. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if every spoonful was a monumental effort. She ate half of what was in the bowl and then pushed it back towards him. A clear gesture. Share. Silas stared at the offered bowl. An orc, a monster from the woods, was sharing her food with him, her portion of a meal he had provided. It was a gesture of honor, a recognition of his act. In that moment, sitting on the dirty floor of his broken-down hovel, sharing a bowl of bean water with a wounded orc, Silas felt a strange and powerful connection. They were both outcasts, both starving, both clinging to a fragile existence on the edge of a world that wanted them gone. The wall of prejudice in his mind, built over a lifetime of fear and stories, began to crumble. He took the bowl and ate his share, the warm broth a small victory against the cold that surrounded them. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. A fragile seed of trust had been planted in the most unlikely soil. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The next few days passed in a feverish, surreal haze. Silas became a reluctant nursemaid to a giant. Khazar's fever raged for 2 days straight. During that time, she was mostly delirious, muttering in a guttural language he didn't understand. Words like Thrathrak, honor, and blood debt were repeated like a mantra. Silas did what he could. He kept the wound clean, changing the crude wool bandages. He dribbled water into her mouth. He kept the fire alive, burning through his meager woodpile at an alarming rate. He foraged near the hovel for anything edible, finding only bitter roots and a few sorry-looking mushrooms, which he boiled into a thin, unappetizing soup. He barely slept. He'd doze in his chair, the one with 3.5 legs that he had to brace against the wall. He'd wake with a start at every sound she made, his heart pounding. The fear was a constant companion, but it was changing. It was no longer the primal fear of a monster. It was the fear of discovery, the fear of what Lord Peton would do, the fear of what would happen to her if she was found. On the 3rd morning, he awoke to find her eyes clear. The fever had broken. She was watching him, her amber gaze intense and analytical. The silence in the hovel was heavy, charged. "You did not kill me," she said. Her voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together, but the words were clear, spoken in the common tongue, with a thick, harsh accent. Silas, startled, nearly fell off his precarious chair. "No," he managed to say, "I'm not a killer." "You gave me water, food," she continued, her eyes scanning the miserable surroundings. "You used your own blanket to bind my leg." She gestured with her chin to the ragged strips on her thigh. "You were hurt," Silas said simply, shrugging as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It was cold. Khazar was silent for a long time, studying him. He felt like a bug under glass. "Humans in this land kill orcs on sight," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Most do," Silas admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "They're afraid." "Are you not afraid?" she asked, a genuine curiosity in her tone. Silas thought about that. He looked at her, at the sheer power coiled in her frame even as she lay wounded. "I'm terrified," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "But my father used to say, fear is a choice. Kindness is a weapon. I suppose I'm just not very good at being afraid." A strange look passed over Khazar's face. It might have been the orc equivalent of a smile, a slight softening around her eyes. "Your father was a wise warrior." "He was a farmer," Silas corrected gently, "and he's long dead." That simple statement hung in the air, a shared history of loss. The domestic struggle began in earnest. As Khazar's strength slowly returned, she became restless. She was a creature of action, and being helpless was a torment to her. The hovel, which was cramped for Silas, was a cage for her. When she stood, her head nearly brushed the sagging roof beams. One afternoon, Silas returned from a fruitless search for firewood to find Khazar standing in the middle of the room, her weight on her good leg, staring intently at the ceiling. One of the main support beams had a severe crack in it, and the recent storm had worsened it. It sagged dangerously. "That will not hold through the next rain," she rumbled. "I know," Silas said with a sigh. "I don't have the wood to replace it or the strength to fix it." Khazar grunted. Before Silas could protest, she hobbled outside. He followed, panicked that someone might see her. She ignored him, her eyes scanning the edge of the woods. She pointed to a fallen silver birch, thick and solid, that had been brought down by the storm. "That one. Khazar, I can't possibly move that," Silas said, exasperated. "I can't even lift one end." She didn't answer. She limped to the log. Bracing herself, she wrapped her powerful arms around one end. With a deep, guttural roar of effort, she heaved. Muscles bulged in her back and shoulders. The log, which Silas couldn't even budge, lifted from the ground. She dragged it, one agonizing step at a time, back towards the hovel, leaving a deep furrow in the mud. Silas could only watch in stunned silence. When she had the log beside the house, she collapsed, breathing heavily, her face pale, but there was a look of satisfaction in her eyes. The next hour was a masterclass in brute force and desperation. While Silas used his small, dull axe to try and shape the ends, Khazar, using nothing but her incredible strength, managed to knock the old, rotten beam out of place. The roof groaned ominously. Then, together, with her doing most of the lifting and him guiding it, they maneuvered the new beam into position. It fit perfectly. The roof was stable for the first time in years. That evening, as they sat in the relative security of the repaired hovel, a new dynamic had formed. Khazar had begun to pay her debt. She saw his wood axe was hopelessly dull. The next day, she spent hours by the small creek behind the hovel, sharpening the blade on a smooth river stone. She worked with a patient, focused intensity. When she was done, the axe was sharper than it had been when it was new. It could shave the hair from his arm. She also began to point out things in the woods he'd overlooked his whole life. "That root," she'd say, pointing with her chin. "Boil it twice to remove the bitterness. It is filling." Or, "The leaves of that bush, crushed into a paste, will keep the flies from your food." Her knowledge of the wild was profound. Slowly, their larder went from empty to housing a small collection of strange-smelling roots and dried herbs. They were no longer starving, merely hungry. Their bond deepened through these small, shared acts of survival. They began to talk more. He told her about the war, the senselessness of it, the weariness it had left deep in his soul. He told her about his parents, hard-working farmers swallowed by a debt they never truly owed, a fabrication of Lord Peaton's father. He showed her the rusty key he kept on a leather thong around his neck. "It was the key to our farmhouse," he explained, his voice thick with memory. The glint of the rusty key in the dim firelight was a small, painful star. "My mother gave it to me the day we were evicted. She told me to keep it, to remember that we once had a home, a place that was ours." Khazar listened, her expression unreadable but attentive. In return, she offered fragments of her own story. She spoke of the Bloodtusk clan, a proud people with ancient traditions. She spoke of a code of honor that was more important than life itself. She told him about her leader, Thrathrak, who had once been her father's most trusted warrior. He had broken that honor, forming an alliance with a corrupt eastern warlord, a man who paid in gold for access to lands and resources that were not his to sell. Thrathrak had seized power, declaring her and her father's loyalists as traitors. She had been forced to flee, to draw his hunters away from the others who were trying to regroup. "I have a younger sister, Vroma," she said one night, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "She is in hiding with the Loyalists. I swore on my father's tusk I would return for her." In their shared stories of loss and exile, they found common ground. They were a family of two, chosen by circumstance and held together by a fragile thread of mutual respect. He was the compassionate outcast. She was the desperate warrior. In his hovel, they had found a strange sort of sanctuary. But sanctuary was a temporary state. The village was a small place, and secrets had short lives. It was Gerald, the baker's lanky, perpetually curious son, who discovered them. He was making his weekly delivery of the single, overpriced loaf of bread that Silas was forced to buy on credit from Lord Peaton's own mill. Gerald, noticing the new sturdy beam in the roof, grew suspicious. He crept around the side of the hovel and peeked through a grimy window pane. His gasp was audible even through the thick glass. He saw Silas sitting at his table, talking to a giant green-skinned orc who was tending the fire. Gerald didn't wait to see the context. He saw only the monster from the stories. He turned and fled, his feet pounding a frantic rhythm back towards the village square. The discovery spread through Blackwood Fen like a plague. It started as whispers, then grew into fearful, angry murmurs. "Silas Thorne is harboring an orc. A monster in our midst. He's a traitor consorting with the enemy." The prejudice of the village, which had always simmered beneath the surface, now boiled over. It became a solid wall of fear and hatred, directed entirely at the little hovel on the edge of the woods. The few people who had offered Silas a grudging nod in the past now turned their backs on him. When he went to the well, the other villagers would grab their buckets and hurry away, muttering curses and making signs to ward off evil. It was only a matter of time before the news reached the one man who could turn their fear into a weapon. Lord Peaton arrived 2 days later. He didn't come alone. He was flanked by 2 burly, cudgel-wielding guards, men whose loyalty was bought and paid for. Peaton was a man who seemed to thrive in the dampness of poverty, his fine clothes a stark contrast to the misery he oversaw. He was thin and pale, with a pinched face and eyes that held the cold, calculating gleam of a moneylender. He carried a large, leather-bound ledger under his arm like a holy text. It contained the sins and debts of every soul in Blackwood Fen. He didn't bother to knock. One of his guards simply kicked the door open. Peaton stepped inside, his nose wrinkling in disgust at the smell of wood smoke and boiled roots. His eyes swept the small space, noting the stable roof, the neatly sharpened axe, the small pile of firewood. Then his gaze fell on Kaza, who had risen to her full height, her hand resting near the axe. She was an intimidating sight, and even Peaton's guards shifted nervously. "Thorne," Peaton began, his voice a silky, dangerous purr. "It seems you have been busy. Improvements." He made a note in his ledger with a flourish of his quill. "An unlicensed structural repair. Use of unauthorized lumber. A significant improvement tax will be levied, of course." "That was a fallen tree, and the roof was about to collapse," Silas said, his voice trembling slightly. Peaton ignored him, his cold eyes fixed on Kaza. "And this is the source of the rumors." He circled her as if she were a piece of livestock, his gaze lingering on her chipped tusk and the powerful lines of her body. "Harboring a creature of the wood, that is a serious crime, Thorne. It interferes with the king's peace. It endangers the village. It incurs a heavy fine." "She was hurt," Silas protested, stepping forward to stand slightly in front of Kaza. "She meant no harm." "Its intentions are irrelevant," Peaton sneered, tapping his ledger. "The law is the law, and your debt, Thorne, your debt is considerable." He opened the book, the pages crackling in the quiet room. "With the accumulated interest, the fines for illegal harboring of a dangerous creature, and the new improvement taxes. Your debt has now reached a sum you could not possibly pay in 100 lifetimes. The weight of the words crushed Silas. He felt the familiar despair, the cold dampness of his life, threatening to drown him. Piton smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. However, I am a reasonable man. He closed the ledger with a sharp snap. I will give you 1 week, 7 days. Pay the total sum in full. He named a figure that was so astronomical it was meaningless. If you cannot, the debt is called in. This hovel, he said the word with contempt, and the land it sits on will be forfeit to me. And the beast, he nodded at Kaza, will be handed over to the garrison. I hear they pay a handsome bounty for orc heads. He turned and swept out of the hovel, his guards following like carrion birds. The open door let in the cold, grey light of the afternoon. Silas and Kaza were left in the sudden, crushing silence, the impossible demand hanging between them like a guillotine. The trap had been sprung. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Piton wasn't finished yet. The week that followed was a slow-motion nightmare. The invisible wall between Silas's hovel and the village became a physical reality. No one would speak to him. If he approached the village, doors were slammed, shutters were closed. The baker refused to sell him bread, even on his crushing credit. The miller turned him away. He was completely, utterly alone, an island of two in a sea of hostile silence. The despair was a thick, choking fog. Silas would sit for hours staring at the wall, the impossible number Piton had named echoing in his head. It was a mountain made of ink and paper, and it was about to crush him. He felt the weight of his failure, not just for himself, but for her. He had tried to do a kind thing, and in doing so, he had doomed them both. Kaza watched him, her amber eyes filled with a quiet, burning guilt. The wound in her leg was healing, knitting together with the remarkable speed of her kind, but the wound of her conscience was fresh and raw. She was the cause of this. Her presence was the weapon Piton was using against this strange, kind human who had saved her. One evening, as Silas listlessly stirred a pot of thin root stew, Kaza finally spoke. I should leave, she said, her voice a low rumble of self-recrimination. If I am gone, Piton has no leverage. The fine for harboring me will be gone. Silas stopped stirring. He looked at her, at the genuine pain in her expression. He saw her honor, her willingness to sacrifice herself to solve the problem she believed she had created. A month ago, he might have agreed. He might have seen the logic in it. But something had changed in the small, damp hovel. And where would you go? He asked softly. Your leg is still weak. The whole countryside is on alert. The villagers would hunt you down before you reach the woods. Or Piton's men would. It is a risk I must take, she insisted. This is my fault. No, Silas said, his voice suddenly firm, laced with an iron he rarely used. He put the spoon down and turned to face her fully. This is not your fault. This is Piton's fault. This is the villagers' fault. This is a debt that started before I was born. You didn't create this problem, Kaza. You just revealed how deep it goes. He took a step closer, his eyes meeting hers. When I found you, this was just a house, a leaking, miserable place I was slowly dying in. But these last few weeks, we fixed the roof. We found food. We talked. It started to feel like, he trailed off searching for the word, a home. We are in this together now. This is our home. I'm not letting you go. The words hung in the air between them. Home, family, choice. The bond that had been forming, fragile as a spider's thread, now solidified into something strong as steel. Kaza stared at him, her warrior's heart shaken by the fierce loyalty of this physically weak but morally indomitable human. She gave a slow, solemn nod. Together, she agreed. The word was a vow. Their fragile unity was to be tested sooner than they imagined. On the 5th day, a new terror arrived. They didn't ride into the village quietly. They came like a storm, a thunder of heavy boots and clanking iron. 4 of them, all orcs, broad and brutal-looking. They were clad in black iron armor, marked with the emblem of a jagged skull. They walked into the village square as if they owned it, their arrogance a palpable force. Their leader was a mountain of an orc, even larger than Khazar. A thick, jagged scar ran from his brow to his jaw, giving his face a permanent snarl. He carried a massive, double-headed axe strapped to his back, its edges chipped from use. This was Thrathrak's skull render. Silas and Khazar watched from the window of the hovel, hidden in the shadows. Khazar's body went rigid. A low, dangerous growl vibrated in her chest. "Thrathrak," she breathed, her hand clenching into a fist. Thrathrak wasn't subtle. He strode to the village well, his warriors fanning out around him, their cruel eyes scanning the terrified faces of the villagers who had scurried out of their homes drawn by the commotion. "I am looking for a deserter," Thrathrak boomed, his voice echoing off the buildings. "A thief and a traitor, a female named Khazar. She is wounded. Some of you sniveling humans must have seen her." He unslung a heavy pouch from his belt and slammed it onto the lip of the well. It landed with the heavy, unmistakable clink of gold. "A reward for whoever brings me to her. A quick death for whoever is hiding her." His eyes, small and black and full of malice, swept the crowd. He was everything Khazar had described. Bloodthirsty, arrogant, devoid of true honor. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to claim a prize. The village was now trapped between 2 predators. On one side, Lord Piton, the bureaucratic wolf who would bleed them dry with his ledgers. On the other, Thrathrak's skull render, the ravenous bear who would tear them apart for sport. And Silas and Khazar were the bait in the center of the trap. The day of the deadline arrived, grey and ominous. The sky was the color of old pewter, threatening a rain it never delivered. It was as if the world was holding its breath. At mid-morning, Lord Piton made his move. He sent his 2 guards from door to door, summoning every villager to the small, muddy patch of ground in front of Silas Thorne's hovel. It was to be a public spectacle, an example. The villagers gathered, a huddled, fearful mass. They stood in a wide semicircle, their faces a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grim, morbid curiosity. They wanted to see the end of the man who brought a monster into their midst, yet they also hated the man who was about to ruin him, for they knew any one of them could be next. Lord Piton arrived, preening in his fine coat, his ledger held tight. He positioned himself directly in front of Silas's door. A moment later, Thrathrak and his 3 warriors emerged from the woods, taking up a position on the other side of the clearing. They leaned on their weapons, radiating impatience and violence. The stage was set. "Silas Thorne." Piton's voice was high and sharp, cutting through the tense silence. "Your time is up. The debt is due. Do you have payment for me?" The door of the hovel opened. Silas stepped out. He looked smaller and more frail than ever, standing before the assembled crowd and the twin threats of Piton and Thrathrak. He was pale. His clothes were ragged, but his shoulders were straight. Behind him, in the shadows of the doorway, Khazar stood, a silent, powerful sentinel. Silas looked at Piton, his gaze steady. "I cannot pay your debt, my lord," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "The sum is impossible." A triumphant smirk spread across Piton's face. "A pity," he said with false sympathy. "Then, as per our agreement, this land and this pathetic structure are now my property. You are evicted." He made a grand sweeping gesture. "As for the other matter, The fine for harboring a fugitive monster. I believe I have found a way for you to pay that debt." He turned to Thrathrak, offering a slight, obsequious bow. "Warlord Thrathrak, the creature you seek is within. As magistrate of this village, I turn her over to you. Consider the bounty a settlement of Thorn's outstanding fine." He was trying to kill two birds with one stone, clearing his ledger and currying favor with a powerful new force in the region. Thrathrak grinned, a horrifying display of sharp teeth. "Excellent. I do enjoy efficient business." He hefted his axe, preparing to claim his prize. It was then that Silas moved. He took 2 steps forward, planting himself directly between Piton's guards and the doorway where Khazar stood. He was a scarecrow standing against a hurricane, a ridiculous, hopeless gesture. But it was a stand nonetheless. "No," he said. The word was so quiet, so unexpected, that it stunned the clearing into absolute silence. Piton blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say, Thorn?" "I said no," Silas repeated, his voice gaining strength. He looked not at Piton, but at the faces of his neighbors, the people who had shunned him. "She is not a beast. She's not a monster. Her name is Khazar." He then turned his gaze on Thrathrak, a man he had no business challenging. "And she is under the protection of this house." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thrathrak let out a short, barking laugh of disbelief. "The protection of a mud hut? You are either very brave or very stupid, little man." "He is my family," a new voice rumbled, and Khazar stepped out of the shadows into the full, grey light. She moved with a warrior's grace, her limp barely noticeable. She came to stand beside Silas, dwarfing him. They were a study in contrasts, the giant, powerful orc and the small, weary human. But they stood as one. This was the turning point. This was the moment the fragile seed of trust bloomed into an act of open rebellion. Khazar ignored Piton completely. Her burning amber eyes were locked on Thrathrak. "You hunt me, Thrathrak," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You call me traitor, but you are the one who wears the serpent's mark." She reached into a pouch at her belt and held up not gold, not a weapon, but a small flat stone carved with the image of a tusked mammoth. The symbol was ancient, powerful. Even Thrathrak's own warriors shifted uneasily at the sight of it. "I am Khazar, daughter of Grothmar, true chieftain of the Bloodtusk clan," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "This is the chieftain's seal, and I name you, Thrathrak, as the usurper. You broke the ancient bond. You poisoned my father with promises of human gold from your master in the east. You are the one who brought dishonor to our people." Thrathrak's grin vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. "Lies! She is a crazed exile." "Seize her!" he roared at his warriors. But they hesitated. Khazar's words, combined with the sight of the chieftain's seal, had struck a chord of ancient honor that Thrathrak's leadership had long ignored. She wasn't just fighting him, she was challenging his very legitimacy. "I challenge you to the right of truth," Khazar boomed, pressing her advantage. "Here now, let the ancestors judge your honor, if you have any left." It was a brilliant move, a challenge of ritual and truth, not just a brawl. Thrathrak, a creature of simple, brutal violence, was caught off guard. To accept was to risk being exposed by ancient laws he no longer respected. To refuse was to prove himself a coward and a liar in front of his own men. While he was still reeling, his authority crumbling, Khazar turned her attention to the stunned Lord Piton. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous growl. She pointed a thick finger at the skull emblem on Thrathrak's armor. "That is the mark of the Eastern warlord, Corval, the man who pays Thrathrak for access to these woods, for the right to hunt and log and mine." Then she pointed at the ledger in Piton's trembling hands. "When you were in our home, I saw the mark, on the inside cover of your book. a faint impression of the same symbol. Your family has been taking bribes from Corval for 2 generations, selling off the king's land piece by piece, while you tax these poor people into starvation to cover your treason. She had noticed it, a tiny detail Silas had missed, the pressure of Piton's signet ring, which bore the hidden mark, had left a faint imprint on the leather. The debt Silas Thorne owes you is a fiction, Kaza announced to the entire village. But the debt you owe the crown, Lord Piton, is for treason, and the penalty for that is death. The truth, a weapon far sharper than any axe, had been revealed. The debt was paid not with gold, but with the exposure of a far greater crime. A shocked silence fell over the crowd, and then a low murmur began to build. A murmur of anger. The villagers looked from Piton's pale, terrified face to the ledger in his hand, and for the first time, they saw not a symbol of their failure, but the key to their oppression. The wall of prejudice had shattered, and in its place was a rising tide of fury. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Thrathrak, his authority in tatters and his secret alliance exposed, chose the only path he knew: violence. With a roar of pure rage, he swung his massive axe not at Kaza, but at Silas, the source of his humiliation. "You die first, little man." But Kaza was faster. She moved like a blur, not meeting his brute force with her own, but deflecting it. She used the handle of the axe Silas had sharpened for her, catching the haft of Thrathrak's weapon and twisting. The move was pure skill, using his own momentum against him. The huge axe was torn from his grasp and went spinning into the mud. Before he could recover, she had the sharpened edge of her own axe at his throat. "Yield," she commanded, her voice cold as ice. Thrathrak's warriors, seeing their leader so utterly and honorably defeated, seeing his dishonor laid bare for all to witness, did not move to help him. They lowered their own weapons, a clear sign of shifting allegiance. Thrathrak, panting and weaponless, stared into Kaza's unforgiving eyes and saw his end. But she did not kill him. "Death would be a mercy you have not earned," she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "You are stripped of your rank. You are exiled. Go back to your human master, Corval, and tell him the Bloodtusk clan is not for sale. Tell him we will not forget this." She lowered her axe. "Go, now." Shamed, defeated, and utterly alone, Thrathrak scrambled to his feet. He gave one last look of pure hatred at Kaza and Silas, then turned and fled into the woods, a warlord without a warband. His 3 former warriors remained, and after a moment's hesitation, their leader approached Kaza and knelt, placing his fist over his heart in a gesture of fealty. The first step to reclaiming her clan had been taken. With Thrathrak gone, all eyes turned to Lord Piton. He was white as a sheet, his composure shattered. He tried to bluster, to deny, but it was too late. The miller, a big man who had lost his family farm to Piton's father, strode forward. "Let's see that book," he said, his voice a low growl. Piton clutched the ledger to his chest, but he was no match for the enraged villagers. The book was torn from his hands. They found the hidden mark, just as Kaza had said. They found pages of falsified records, of invented debts, of generations of systematic theft. The proof of his treason and their long suffering was undeniable. Piton tried to flee, but he was surrounded. The anger of people with nothing left to lose is a powerful force. They did not kill him, but they bound him with rope and locked him in his own storehouse to await the arrival of the king's magistrate, a real one this time. That evening, a great bonfire was lit in the village square. Into it, page by page, went the records from Lord Piton's ledger. Decades of fabricated debt, of indentured servitude, of quiet desperation, all turned to ash and smoke. It was a baptism by fire, cleansing the village of the dampness of poverty that had clung to it for so long. Silas stood with Kaza, watching the flames leap into the night sky. and felt a weight lift from his soul that he had carried his entire life. The days that followed were a revelation. The cloud of fear and debt was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. The villagers, ashamed of their fear and profoundly grateful for their liberation, began to approach the hovel on the edge of the woods. They came not with suspicion, but with gifts. The baker brought a basket of fresh, warm bread. The miller brought a sack of flour. A farmer brought a wheel of cheese and a cask of ale. They were offerings of peace, of apology, of thanks. They also came with tools and strong arms. "That roof beam is good, but the thatch is still rotten," the miller said, gesturing with his thumb. "We can fix that." And so they did. A crew of villagers descended on the hovel. They stripped the old, mouldy thatch and replaced it with fresh, sweet-smelling straw. They patched the walls, replaced the sagging door, and even installed a real window pane where the grimy glass had been. Silas's hovel, the symbol of his poverty, was transformed. It became a cottage, solid, warm, and bright. It became a home. Kaza chose to stay. Her path led back to the Bloodtusk clan, to her sister, Froma, and to the fight to restore her people's honor. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. Here, in this small, insignificant human village, she had found an unexpected ally. She had found family. The 3 orc warriors who had sworn fealty to her became her honor guard, and to the shock of the villagers, they began to trade their skills, teaching the humans better ways to track and hunt in exchange for lessons in farming and building. The first, tentative seeds of a new mixed community were being sown. One evening, Silas and Kaza sat outside their repaired home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was clean, the scent of fresh-cut wood and baking bread drifting from the village. The silence was comfortable, easy. Silas reached up and touched the rusty key that still hung around his neck. For so long, it had been a symbol of everything he had lost, a bitter reminder of a stolen past. But now, as he looked from the key to the warm light spilling from his own front door, and then to the powerful, honorable friend sitting beside him, he realized its meaning had changed. It was no longer about a door that was closed forever. It was about the one he had chosen to open. It was a key to a future he never could have imagined. A future built not on blood or species, but on a simple, revolutionary act of kindness. He had found his home, not in a place, but in a choice. And that is how a poor human and a noble orc warrior proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.